The door exploded open. Aaron Murray froze. His nanny was breastfeeding his baby. But Florence wasn't lactating when he hired her 6 months ago. His dead wife couldn't breastfeed. So how was this possible? And why did Florence's eyes scream terror when she saw him standing there? The briefcase crashed to the floor. Olive was finally quiet for the first time in weeks. But the woman holding his daughter was hiding something that would destroy everything he thought he knew about the person he'd trusted with his child's life. The mahogany door to the nursery creaked open with barely a whisper, but to Florence Vasquez, it might as well have been a gunshot. She froze, her dark eyes widening as they met the steel-gray gaze of Aaron Murray across the softly lit room. Time seemed suspended in that moment, the gentle hum of the white noise machine, the sweet scent of baby powder hanging in the air, and the warmth of little Olive nestled against her chest. Aaron stood motionless in the doorway, his expensive Italian suit wrinkled from his red-eye flight from Tokyo, his usually perfect hair disheveled. His briefcase hit the marble floor with a sharp crack that made both adults wince, though mercifully, baby Olive remained peacefully asleep. Mr. Murray." Florence's voice caught in her throat as she instinctively pulled the soft cashmere blanket higher around herself and the 6-month-old infant. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched a storm of emotions flicker across her employer's face: surprise, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Aaron's jaw tightened, the muscle there pulsing as he gripped the doorframe. What exactly is going on here? His voice was barely above a whisper, but the underlying tension made Florence's skin prickle with goosebumps. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its deep resonance echoing through the sprawling penthouse. Florence had thought she was alone. Aaron wasn't supposed to return from his business trip until morning. She'd been caring for Olive through another one of her colicky episodes, and when nothing else worked to soothe the crying baby, desperation had driven her to the most natural solution she could offer. She was inconsolable, Florence whispered, her accent thickening with emotion as it always did when she was nervous. "For 3 hours, Mr. Murray. Nothing worked, not the formula, not the rocking, not the music box your wife used to." She trailed off, immediately regretting the mention of Victoria. Aaron's expression darkened at the reference to his late wife, and Florence watched as his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The loss was still raw. Victoria had died just 2 months after Olive's birth, leaving Aaron a widower at 34 and Florence as the primary caretaker for a baby who seemed to cry more than she slept. "You had no right," he started, his voice rough with an emotion Florence couldn't name. "She needed comfort," Florence interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "I know it's unusual, but my body." She felt heat flood her cheeks as she struggled to explain something so intimate to the man who signed her paychecks. How could she tell him that her own recent miscarriage had left her body still capable of providing what his daughter desperately needed? Aaron took a step into the room, and Florence caught the faint scent of his cologne mixed with exhaustion and airplane recycled air. His eyes, usually so controlled and businesslike, seemed to burn with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Don't," he said quietly, but there was something broken in his voice now. "Don't explain. Not yet." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of a boundary that had just been irreversibly crossed. Florence could feel Olive's tiny fist curled against her skin, the baby's breathing slow and peaceful for the first time in hours. But peace was the last thing Florence felt as she looked up at the man who held her future, and possibly her heart, in his hands. What would happen now? How could she explain that in caring for his daughter, she'd found a healing she hadn't expected? And why, in this moment of vulnerability and shock, did the way Aaron was looking at her make her feel more exposed than the intimate act he'd just witnessed? What do you think Florence should say to explain herself? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to make a difficult choice to help someone you care about? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The tension in the nursery was suffocating as Aaron slowly closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing like a verdict. Florence watched his every movement, cataloging the way his shoulders carried the weight of grief and responsibility, the way his eyes, so like Olive's, seemed to hold storms she'd never been brave enough to weather. "Tell me," he said finally, settling into the leather armchair beside the crib, the one Victoria had chosen during her pregnancy. His voice was gentler now, but Florence could hear the careful control beneath it. "Tell me everything." Florence adjusted Olive carefully, the baby's dark lashes fanned against her cheek in perfect contentment. "I lost my daughter 3 months ago," she whispered, the words still feeling like broken glass in her throat. "Sophia." She would have been Olive's age now. Aaron's sharp intake of breath cut through the quiet. In all the months she'd worked for him, Florence had never spoken of her past, never revealed why she'd answered his desperate ad for a nanny with such urgency. He'd hired her because she was qualified, experienced, and most importantly, because she had a way with Olive that his previous 3 nannies hadn't possessed. "Florence." He started, but she shook her head. "I never meant for this to happen," she continued, her free hand unconsciously smoothing Olive's wispy dark hair. "But tonight, when Olive wouldn't stop crying, when nothing I tried worked, my body remembered what it was designed to do. And she needed comfort so desperately." The truth hung between them like a fragile bridge. Florence had fled to New York after losing Sophia and the baby's father in a car accident back in Barcelona. She'd taken the nanny position not just for the generous salary, but because caring for Olive filled a hollow space in her soul that nothing else could touch. Aaron leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. "Victoria tried everything to breastfeed," he said quietly. "She was devastated when she couldn't produce enough milk. Olive was colicky from the beginning, and Victoria blamed herself." His voice cracked slightly. "She died thinking she'd failed as a mother." Florence's heart clenched at the raw pain in his voice. She'd seen glimpses of his grief over the past 6 months, the way he sometimes stood in the nursery doorway just watching Olive sleep, the photos of Victoria he'd quietly removed from common areas but kept in his study, the way he worked impossibly long hours as if exhaustion could numb the loss. "She didn't fail," Florence said softly. "Olive knows she was loved." "Does she?" Aaron's gray eyes met hers, and Florence saw vulnerability there that took her breath away. "Sometimes I look at her and see Victoria so clearly it steals the air from my lungs. Other times, I'm terrified I'm nothing but a stranger to my own daughter." Florence had watched him with Olive, the careful way he held her, as if she might break, the wonder in his eyes when she smiled, the panic when she cried. She'd seen him reading parenting books at 2 a.m. when he thought no one was watching, had found him asleep in the nursery chair more than once after particularly difficult nights. "You're not a stranger," Florence assured him. "You should see how her eyes light up when you come home. She knows your voice, your touch. She feels safe with you." Aaron's expression softened, and for a moment, Florence glimpsed the man behind the grief, warm, devoted, desperately trying to be enough for his daughter. It was a side of him that made her chest tight with an emotion she had no right to feel. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "How are you healing?" The question caught her off guard. In 6 months of employment, he'd never asked about her personal life, never pried into her past. Their relationship had been strictly professional, despite the intimacy of sharing a home and caring for his child. "Some days are easier than others," she admitted. "Caring for Olive, it helps. She needs me, and I need to be needed." Aaron studied her face in the soft glow of the nightlight, and Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks under his scrutiny. She'd always found him attractive. What woman wouldn't? But she'd carefully buried those feelings beneath layers of professionalism and the knowledge that she was just an employee, easily replaceable. "I never knew," he said, "about your loss. I should have. You hired me to care for Olive, not to share my personal tragedy," Florence interrupted. "I didn't want your pity." "It wouldn't have been pity." His voice was rough with sincerity. "We both know what it's like to lose someone we can't live without." The words hung in the air between them, creating an intimacy Florence hadn't expected. She could see the man Victoria had fallen in love with, the one who felt everything deeply but kept it locked away behind walls of control and responsibility. Olive stirred in her arms, making the soft mewing sounds that usually preceded crying, but she settled again when Florence gently rocked her. The motion was so natural, so maternal, that Aaron felt something shift in his chest. "She trusts you completely," he observed, his voice wondering. "Children know who they're safe with," Florence replied, then caught herself. The implication of her words, that Olive felt safer with her than with her own father, hung awkwardly between them. But Aaron didn't look offended. Instead, he looked grateful. "I don't know what Olive and I would have done without you these past months," he admitted. "You've been your employee," Florence finished for him, but her voice was softer now, questioning. "More than that," Aaron said quietly, and Florence's pulse quickened at the intensity in his gaze. "You've been the mother figure Olive needed. The stability I couldn't provide while drowning in my own grief." Florence felt tears prick her eyes at his honesty. "Olive saved me too," she whispered. "When I thought I had nothing left to live for, she gave me purpose." The admission created a fragile bond between them, an understanding that transcended employer and employee. They were two broken people who had found healing in caring for this precious child. But as Aaron's gaze dropped to where Olive lay peaceful against Florence's chest, Florence saw something flicker in his eyes that made her breath catch. Something that looked almost like longing? What did it mean? And what would happen now that the careful boundaries between them had been shattered by one moment of desperate tenderness? The soft chime of Aaron's phone shattered the intimate bubble that had formed around them. He glanced at the screen, his expression immediately hardening as he read the message. Florence watched the transformation with growing unease. The vulnerable man who had just shared his grief was disappearing behind the cold mask of the ruthless businessman. "What is it?" she asked softly, careful not to disturb Olive, who had finally drifted into deep sleep. Aaron's jaw clenched as he typed a rapid response. "My mother," he said tersely. "She's coming to visit tomorrow. Unannounced." Florence felt a chill run down her spine. She'd heard about Margaret Murray from the other staff, a woman who controlled the family fortune with an iron fist and had never approved of Aaron's marriage to Victoria, a common teacher from Queens. The woman had barely acknowledged Olive's existence, too busy mourning the loss of what she considered suitable heirs. "She doesn't know about tonight," Aaron continued, his voice tight with stress. "About this situation." "This situation?" Florence repeated, stung by his choice of words. The tender moment they'd shared suddenly felt fragile, threatened by the intrusion of his family's expectations. Aaron ran his hands through his hair, the gesture revealing his exhaustion. "Florence, you have to understand. My mother controls the Murray Trust Fund, Olive's inheritance. If she thinks there's anything inappropriate happening in this house." The implication hung in the air like a threat. Florence felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of shame and anger. "Inappropriate? I was caring for your daughter. Nothing more." "I know that," Aaron said quickly, but his eyes avoided hers. "But my mother won't see it that way. She'll see a young, beautiful nanny in a compromising position with her son. She'll assume the worst." Florence carefully stood, moving Olive to her crib with practiced ease. The baby settled without stirring, her tiny fist curled near her cheek. When Florence turned back to Aaron, her posture was rigid with wounded pride. "And what do you see, Mr. Murray?" she asked, her formal tone creating distance between them. Aaron's eyes snapped to hers, something desperate flickering in their depths. "Florence." The nursery door burst open without warning, making both adults freeze. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly housekeeper, stood in the doorway with her phone pressed to her ear, her face flushed with panic. "Oh, Mr. Murray, thank goodness you're home," she gasped, lowering the phone. "There's been an accident. Your mother's car. She's in the hospital." Aaron was on his feet instantly. "What happened? Is she?" "She's stable, but they're keeping her overnight for observation. A drunk driver ran a red light downtown." Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands. "She was asking for you, insisting she needed to tell you something urgent about Olive." Florence watched Aaron's face pale. Whatever his complicated relationship with his mother, the fear in his eyes was genuine. But there was something else too, a flicker of dread that went beyond concern for Margaret's health. "I have to go," he said, already moving toward the door. He paused, looking back at Florence with an expression she couldn't read. We'll talk when I get back." After he left, Florence sank into the nursery chair, her mind racing. What could Margaret Murray possibly need to tell Aaron about Olive that was so urgent she'd risk traveling at night in winter weather? Mrs. Henderson lingered in the doorway, her kind face troubled. "Miss Florence," she said quietly, "there's something you should know. Mrs. Murray Sr. She's been asking questions about you. About your background, your qualifications." Florence's blood ran cold. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests she's looking for reasons to have you dismissed. Mrs. Henderson's expression was sympathetic but worried. "She never approved of how attached Mr. Aaron has become to you. And Olive's obvious preference for you over the previous nannies has made her suspicious." The older woman's words confirmed Florence's worst fears. She'd always known her position in the Murray household was precarious, but she'd foolishly begun to hope that her bond with Olive, and whatever was growing between her and Aaron, might be enough to secure her place here. "There's more," Mrs. Henderson continued reluctantly. "She's hired a private investigator. I overheard her on the phone last week, asking about your past, your family situation in Spain." Florence's heart hammered against her ribs. If Margaret's investigator dug deep enough, they would uncover the tragedy that had brought her to New York. But worse, they might twist the facts to paint her as an unstable woman who was using Olive to replace her own lost child. As if sensing her distress, Olive began to fuss in her crib. Florence moved to comfort her automatically, but as she lifted the baby, a terrible thought struck her. What if tonight, Aaron walking in on her breastfeeding Olive, wasn't an accident? What if someone had told him she would be there, in that intimate moment, knowing it would create exactly this kind of scandal? The grandfather clock chimed 1 a.m., and Florence realized with growing dread that Aaron's early return, his mother's mysterious urgent message, and the sudden investigation into her background couldn't all be coincidences. Someone was orchestrating her downfall, and she was walking straight into their trap. But as Olive settled peacefully in her arms once again, Florence felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. Whatever game was being played, whatever forces were aligning against her, she wouldn't let them hurt this innocent child. Olive had already lost one mother. Florence would fight heaven and hell before she'd let her lose another. The question was, when the battle lines were drawn, which side would Aaron choose? His family's money and expectations, or the woman who had become Olive's lifeline, and perhaps his own? Do you think Aaron will stand up to his mother to protect Florence? What would you do if you had to choose between family expectations and doing what's right? Let us know your thoughts below. The morning light filtering through the penthouse windows felt harsh and unforgiving as Florence paced the nursery, Olive fussing in her arms. Aaron hadn't returned from a hospital, and his absence felt like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Every time her phone buzzed with a text from him, brief clinical updates about his mother's condition, Florence felt the distance between them growing wider. Mother stable. Discussing Olive's future. Home tonight. Florence stared at the message, her stomach churning at the phrase Olive's future. As if the baby were a business asset to be negotiated rather than a child who needed love and stability. Miss Florence. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her usually warm demeanor strained. "There are some people here to see you." Florence's heart sank as she followed the housekeeper to the main foyer, Olive still in her arms. Two stern-faced individuals stood waiting, a woman in a crisp navy suit carrying a briefcase, and a man with a notebook who looked like he'd stepped out of a detective novel. "Miss Vasquez." The woman stepped forward with a cold smile. "I'm Jennifer Morrison from Child Protective Services, and this is Detective Walsh from the NYPD. We need to speak with you about your employment here." The words hit Florence like a physical blow. CPS? The police? Olive began to cry, as if sensing the threat in the room, and Florence instinctively held her closer. I don't understand, Florence managed, her accent thickening with fear. What is this about? Detective Walsh consulted his notebook. We've received reports of concerning behavior involving the care of the minor child. Questions about your psychological fitness and appropriate boundaries. Florence felt the world tilting around her. Who made these reports? That's confidential, Morrison replied smoothly. But we're required to investigate any allegations involving the welfare of a child, especially when unconventional care methods are involved. The euphemism hung in the air like poison. Someone had told them about last night, but how? The only people who knew were Erin herself, and Florence's mind raced. Had Mrs. Henderson seen something? Had there been security cameras in the nursery that she'd forgotten about? I would like to call Mr. Murray, Florence said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady for Olive's sake. Mr. Murray is the one who requested this investigation, Morrison said, and Florence felt her knees nearly buckle. That's impossible, Florence whispered, but even as she said it, doubt crept in. Erin's strange behavior that morning, his cryptic texts, his mother's sudden accident. What if it had all been orchestrated? Detective Walsh stepped closer, his expression not unkind but uncompromising. Miss Vasquez, we understand you recently suffered a personal loss. Sometimes grief can cloud judgment, make people do things they wouldn't normally consider appropriate. Florence's chest tightened with panic. They knew about Sophia. Somehow, they knew everything. My personal situation has nothing to do with how I care for Olive. I love her. That's exactly what concerns us, Morrison interrupted. When caregivers become overly attached, especially those dealing with their own trauma, lines can get blurred. Children can become substitutes for what was lost. Olive's cries grew louder, and Florence bounced her gently, the familiar motion calming them both. She's not a substitute, Florence said fiercely. She's a little girl who needs love and care, and I provide that. Her father knows. Her father is concerned about the intensity of your attachment, Detective Walsh said gently. He mentioned some incidents that made him question whether professional boundaries were being maintained. Florence's world crumbled around her. Erin had betrayed her. After their tender moment last night, after sharing their pain and finding connection, he had turned her vulnerability into a weapon against her. But as Olive's cries softened in response to Florence's soothing voice, a different possibility occurred to her. What if Erin hadn't made the call? What if someone else was using his name, his authority, to orchestrate this nightmare? I want to see documentation, Florence said suddenly, her voice stronger. I want to see exactly who made these reports and when. Morrison's smile faltered slightly. Miss Vasquez, I think it would be best if you cooperated fully with our investigation. For everyone's sake, including the child's. And I think it would be best if you provided proof of your allegations before you try to separate a baby from the only stable caregiver she's known since her mother died. Florence's protective instincts flared, overriding her fear. The front door opened with a sharp bang, and Erin strode in, his face thunderous. He took in the scene, Florence clutching Olive, the two officials, Mrs. Henderson hovering anxiously, and his expression darkened further. What the hell is going on here? He demanded. Detective Walsh stepped forward. Mr. Murray, we're following up on your concerns about... My concerns. Erin's voice was deadly quiet. I never contacted CPS or the police about Miss Vasquez. Morrison consulted her tablet, frowning. Sir, we have a recorded call from this number at 3:47 a.m., expressing serious concerns about inappropriate behavior. I was at the hospital all night, Erin cut her off. And I certainly didn't make any calls about Florence. His eyes found hers across the room, and Florence saw something there that made her breath catch. Not betrayal, but fury on her behalf. Olive had gone quiet in Florence's arms, her little hand fisted in the fabric of Florence's sweater. The baby seemed to sense the tension, her wide gray eyes, so like her father's, darting between the adults. "Then who?" Florence began, but Aaron was already pulling out his phone. "Morrison, was it?" He fixed the CPS worker with a stare that could cut glass. "I want to see your identification. And Detective Walsh, I want the exact details of this alleged phone call. Because someone is playing games with my family, and I intend to find out who." Florence felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by fear. If Aaron wasn't behind this, then who was? And what would they try next? As if summoned by her thoughts, Aaron's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. "It's the hospital," he said quietly. "My mother wants to see me. She says she has information about Florence that can't wait." Florence met his eyes across the room, and in that moment, she saw the battle lines being drawn. Whatever Margaret Murray had planned, whatever trap she'd set, it was about to spring closed around them. But this time, Florence wasn't facing it alone. "We're going together," Aaron said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. "All three of us. It's time my mother met the woman who saved my daughter's life." Florence felt tears prick her eyes at his words, at the choice he was making. But she also felt the weight of impending confrontation. Margaret Murray was a formidable enemy, and she'd just declared war. The question was, would love and truth be enough to win it? The private hospital room was a study in controlled luxury: cream walls, fresh orchids, and the soft hum of expensive medical equipment. Margaret Murray sat propped against silk pillows, her silver hair perfectly styled despite her overnight stay. Her pale blue eyes, so unlike Aaron's warm gray ones, fixed on Florence with the precision of a hawk spotting prey. "Aaron, darling," Margaret's voice was honey over steel. "How thoughtful of you to bring the help." Florence felt the deliberate slight like a slap, but Aaron's hand found the small of her back, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by his mother. "Her name is Florence," Aaron said coolly. "And she's here because whatever you have to say concerns Olive's welfare." Margaret's gaze dropped to Olive, who was sleeping peacefully in Florence's arms, seemingly oblivious to the tension crackling through the room. For just a moment, something soft flickered across the older woman's features, genuine affection for her granddaughter. "Yes, Olive," Margaret murmured. "My poor, sweet granddaughter. If only she knew the truth about the woman caring for her." Florence's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What truth would that be, Mrs. Murray?" Margaret smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut. "Shall we start with your real name? Or perhaps your real reason for coming to America?" Aaron stepped forward, his body tense. "Mother, what are you talking about?" "Oh, my dear boy," Margaret's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Did you really think I wouldn't investigate the woman you've become so attached to? The woman my sources tell me you were found with in a rather compromising position last night." Florence's blood ran cold. Security cameras. There had to be security cameras in the penthouse that she'd forgotten about. Aaron's face darkened with understanding at the same moment. "You've been watching us," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I've been protecting my family," Margaret corrected. "Which is more than I can say for you, apparently." She reached for a manila folder on her bedside table. Florence Maria Santos Vasquez. Born in Barcelona, Spain. Married at 19 to Carlos Santos, a known associate of several unsavory characters involved in questionable financial activities. Florence felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She hadn't used Carlos's surname since fleeing Spain, hadn't told anyone about the darkness that had consumed her late husband in his final months. "That's enough," Aaron said, but Margaret continued relentlessly. Widowed at 23 when Carlos and their infant daughter were killed in what Spanish police suspect was not an accident, but a targeted hit related to his business associates. Margaret's eyes glittered with triumph. "Tell me, Miss Santos, how many people know you're in New York? How many dangerous people might be looking for Carlos's widow?" Florence's knees nearly buckled. The truth was even more devastating than Margaret could know. Carlos had been laundering money for a criminal organization, and Florence had discovered evidence of his activities just days before his death. She'd fled Barcelona not just from grief, but from fear that his associates would silence her permanently. "You're lying," Aaron said, but his voice lacked conviction as he looked at Florence's pale face. "Am I?" Margaret pulled out a photograph surveillance footage showing Florence entering a Spanish police station. This was taken 2 days before she left Barcelona. She was there for 3 hours, Aaron. 3 hours talking to authorities about her husband's criminal activities. Florence closed her eyes, the weight of her secrets crushing down on her. "I was trying to help them," she whispered. "I found files on Carlos's computer, transactions I didn't understand. I thought if I gave the police everything, maybe Sophia's death would mean something." "Sophia?" Margaret's voice sharpened. "Not Sophia, as you told the employment agency." "Interesting." Aaron turned to Florence, his expression torn between concern and betrayal. "Florence, is this true? Is your life in danger?" Before Florence could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her hands shaking, she opened it, and the blood drained from her face. "We know where you are, Florence. Time to pay Carlos's debts. Your old friends from Barcelona." The phone slipped from Florence's nerveless fingers, clattering to the hospital floor. Olive stirred in her arms, beginning to fuss as if sensing her caregiver's distress. Margaret leaned forward with predatory satisfaction. "It seems your past has finally caught up with you, my dear. The question is, are you going to drag my granddaughter down with you?" Aaron snatched up Florence's phone, his face hardening as he read the message. When he looked up, Florence saw something that broke her heart: doubt. The trust they'd built, the connection they'd shared, was crumbling under the weight of her secrets. "Florence," his voice was carefully controlled, "who sent this?" "I don't know," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I'd been careful. I changed my name, my appearance. I thought they'd forgotten about me." Forgotten about a woman who testified against a money laundering operation? Margaret's laugh was cold. "My dear girl, you're either incredibly naive or a very skilled actress." Aaron began pacing, his businessman's mind clearly working through the implications. "If they've found you, if they're threatening you, then Olive is in danger," Margaret finished smoothly. "As long as this woman remains in our home, my granddaughter is at risk. Surely even you can see that, Aaron." Florence looked down at Olive, who had quieted again and was gazing up at her with those trusting gray eyes. The baby's tiny hand was wrapped around Florence's finger, holding on as if she knew what was coming. "There's more, isn't there, Mother?" Aaron's voice was resigned, as if he already knew the answer. Margaret's smile was triumphant. "The private investigator also discovered that Miss Santos here has been receiving payments from an account in the Cayman Islands. Payments that started just 1 week after she began working for you." Florence's head snapped up. "That's impossible. I've never." "Haven't you?" Margaret pulled out bank statements. $5,000 a month, deposited into an account opened in your name. Money that can be traced back to several shell companies with ties to Carlos's former associates. Florence stared at the documents, her mind reeling. Someone had been using her identity to receive payments, setting her up to look like she was still connected to the criminal organization that had destroyed her life. "It's a setup," she breathed. "Someone's been planning this." "Of course it is," said a new voice from the doorway, and Florence's heart stopped. Detective Martinez stood in the entrance to the hospital room, but his expression wasn't the one Florence remembered from their conversations in Barcelona. His smile was cold, predatory, and Florence suddenly understood the scope of the trap that had been laid for her. "Hello, Florence," he said in Spanish. "Did you really think you could disappear forever?" Aaron stepped protectively in front of Florence and Olive, though Florence could see the confusion and fear in his posture. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been looking for your nanny for a very long time," Martinez replied in accented English. "Someone who has unfinished business with her." Florence's worst nightmare was coming true. The man she'd trusted to help her seek justice for Carlos and Sophia's deaths had been working with their killers all along. And now he'd found her, in the one place she'd finally felt safe. But as Olive began to cry, responding to the tension in the room, Florence felt something shift inside her. She'd run once before, letting fear dictate her choices. But she wouldn't run again. Not when it meant abandoning Olive to a world without the love and protection she deserved. "What do you want?" Florence asked, her voice stronger than she felt. Martinez's smile widened. "What I've always wanted, Querida. The location of the files Carlos hid before he died. The ones that could destroy some very important people." Florence's heart hammered as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Carlos hadn't just been laundering money, he'd been keeping insurance, evidence that could bring down an entire criminal network. Evidence that Florence didn't even know existed. But as she looked into Olive's innocent face, then up at Aaron's tormented expression, Florence realized something that changed everything. She might not have the files Martinez wanted, but she had something else, people worth fighting for. The question was, would Aaron fight alongside her, or would the web of lies and danger surrounding her finally tear them apart forever? What do you think Florence should do, run to protect Olive and Aaron, or stay and fight? Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting yourself? Share your thoughts below. The hospital security guard who appeared behind Martinez wasn't there to help. Florence realized with growing horror that his hand rested casually on his weapon, and his eyes held the same cold calculation as the fake detectives. They weren't just trapped, they were outnumbered and completely at Martinez's mercy. "Now then," Martinez said pleasantly, as if they were discussing the weather rather than Florence's life, "let's make this simple. You're going to come with me, Florence, and we're going to have a long conversation about Carlos's insurance policy." "She's not going anywhere," Aaron said, his voice steel-wrapped in ice. But Florence could see the helplessness in his posture. What could a businessman do against armed criminals? Martinez laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Mr. Murray, isn't it? The grieving widower who's become so attached to his daughter's nanny." His smile turned predatory. "Tell me, does it bother you knowing she's been lying to you from the moment she walked into your home?" Florence felt Aaron stiffen beside her, and her heart shattered a little more. Every secret revealed was another wedge driven between them, another reason for him to doubt everything they'd built together. "The payments, the false identity, the criminal connections," Margaret added from her hospital bed, her voice dripping with vindicated satisfaction. "Really, Aaron, even you must see that this woman has been using you from the beginning." "That's not true," Florence whispered, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. How could she explain that every lie had been born from love? Love for Olive, love for the safety she'd found in their home, and yes, love for the man who was now looking at her like a stranger. Olive began to cry harder, sensing the tension and fear radiating from Florence. The sound seemed to cut through Aaron like a knife, and he reached instinctively for his daughter. "Give her to me," he said quietly. Florence's arms tightened around Olive automatically. Giving up the baby felt like admitting defeat, like accepting that she was indeed the dangerous criminal they were painting her to be. "Florence," Aaron's voice was gentler now, but firm. "Give me my daughter." The words hit her like a physical blow. My daughter. Not our Olive, not the child they'd been caring for together, but his daughter, with all the legal and emotional weight that implied. With trembling hands, Florence passed Olive to Aaron, their fingers brushing in the transfer. For a moment, their eyes met, and Florence saw something that gave her a fragment of hope, pain, confusion, but not hatred. Not yet. Martinez watched the exchange with amused interest. How touching. But sentiment won't solve our problem, will it, Florence? You still have something that belongs to my employers. I don't know where Carlos hid anything, Florence said desperately. I told the police everything I found. There were no other files, no other. Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Martinez interrupted. You see, Carlos was very clever. He didn't just hide physical files. He embedded the information somewhere his widow would always have access to it. Somewhere she'd carry with her wherever she went. Florence's blood turned to ice as understanding dawned. The locket, she breathed. Martinez's smile widened. Now we're getting somewhere. The locket your dear husband gave you for your anniversary. The one you've worn every day since his death, even here in your new life. Florence's hand flew to her throat, where Carlos's gift rested beneath her sweater. She'd never taken it off, never examined it closely after his death. It had simply been a precious memento of their love, before everything went wrong. You see, Martinez continued conversationally, Carlos suspected his partners might turn on him. So he had a micro SD card embedded inside that pretty little heart you wear. All the account numbers, transaction records, names and dates, everything needed to bring down a very expensive operation. Aaron was staring at Florence with a mixture of shock and something that might have been betrayal. You've been carrying evidence of criminal activity all this time? In my home, around my daughter. I didn't know, Florence protested, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. How many more secrets would be revealed? How many more reasons would he find to distrust her? Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Aaron, you need to think about Olive now. This woman has brought danger to our doorstep, and now these people are in our lives. You have to choose, your daughter's safety or your infatuation with the help. The words hung in the air like an ultimatum. Florence watched Aaron's face, seeing the war between his heart and his responsibility as a father. She knew which side would win, which side had to win. Take it, Florence said quietly, her fingers working at the clasp of the necklace. Take the locket and leave us alone. Oh, my dear Florence, Martinez shook his head with mock regret. I'm afraid it's not that simple. You see, you're the only one who can authenticate the information. Without your testimony, your husband's insurance policy is worthless. Florence's hands stilled on the chain. My testimony? You're going to come with us back to Barcelona, and you're going to explain to certain interested parties exactly what Carlos was up to and how much evidence exists. Martinez's pleasant facade dropped, revealing the predator beneath. And then, if you're very cooperative, we might let you live long enough to see your precious Sophia's grave one more time. Florence's knees buckled at the casual cruelty of his words. Aaron stepped forward instinctively, as if to catch her, but stopped himself, Olive still crying in his arms. You're not taking her anywhere, Aaron said, but his voice lacked conviction. What could he do against armed men? How could he risk Olive's safety for a woman who had lied to him about everything? Martinez pulled out his phone and showed them a photograph that made Florence's blood freeze. It was the penthouse building, taken from the street, with a red circle drawn around the nursery window. Mr. Murray, Martinez said pleasantly, you have a choice. Florence comes with us voluntarily, and you and your daughter continue your lives in peace. Or she refuses, and our associates begin taking a more active interest in your family's well-being. Florence looked at Aaron, seeing the moment when the awful reality hit him. As long as she remained in their lives, Olive would never be safe. The criminals who had killed her husband and daughter wouldn't hesitate to harm an innocent baby if it served their purposes. I'll go, Florence said quietly, her voice breaking. I'll go with you. Just, please leave them alone. Florence, no, Aaron said, but she could hear the relief beneath his protest. Relief that the danger would leave with her. It's better this way, Florence whispered, looking down at Olive one last time. The baby had quieted and was gazing up at her father with those trusting gray eyes, so like Aaron's. She needs you. She needs to be safe. Florence walked to Aaron and gently kissed Olive's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of the child who had become her whole world. Grow up strong, menina, she whispered in Spanish. Know that you are so loved. As she stepped back, Florence caught Aaron's gaze one final time. I'm sorry, she said, the words encompassing every lie, every secret, every moment of happiness she'd stolen by pretending she could belong in their lives. I'm sorry for all of it. Martinez gestured toward the door, his patience clearly wearing thin. Touching goodbyes aside, we have a plane to catch. Florence walked toward the door on unsteady legs, each step taking her further from the only family she'd known since losing her own. At the threshold, she turned back for one last look at the man and child who had saved her from despair, only to watch her condemned to it once again. Aaron stood holding Olive against his chest, his face a mask of conflicted pain. Margaret watched with cold satisfaction from her hospital bed. And Florence knew with crushing certainty that she would never see any of them again. As the hospital room door closed behind her, Florence heard Olive begin to cry again, a sound that would haunt her all the way back to Barcelona, and probably for whatever time she had left. But at least Olive would be safe. At least the child she loved would grow up protected from the darkness that seemed to follow Florence wherever she went. Even if it meant Florence would face that darkness alone. The black sedan had been driving through the Queen's Tunnel for 10 minutes when Florence noticed something that made her pulse quicken with desperate hope. Martinez kept checking his phone with increasing agitation, and the fake security guard was sweating despite the car's air conditioning. Problem? Florence asked quietly from the back seat, her wrists zip-tied but her mind racing. Martinez's smile was strained now, nothing like the confident predator from the hospital. Just a slight delay with our travel arrangements. But Florence caught the flash of genuine worry in his eyes, and suddenly pieces began clicking into place. If Martinez and his associates were so powerful, so well-connected, why had it taken them nearly a year to find her? Why resort to elaborate setups with fake CPS calls and hospital accidents? The answer hit her like lightning. They were desperate. Whatever Carlos had hidden wasn't just evidence, it was something that could destroy them completely, and they were running out of time to retrieve it. Her phone, still tucked in her jacket pocket, buzzed. Martinez had been so focused on getting her out of the hospital that he'd forgotten to confiscate it. Florence shifted carefully, trying to see the message without drawing attention. Florence, Aaron. Stay strong. Help is coming. Trust me. Florence's heart soared even as confusion flooded her mind. How could Aaron help her? How did he even get her number when they'd barely had time to exchange personal information in all their months of professional interaction? The answer came 30 seconds later when the sedan's tires suddenly went flat, both rear wheels simultaneously, sending the car skidding to a controlled stop on the tunnel's shoulder. The fake guard cursed in Spanish, reaching for his weapon, but froze when red and blue lights suddenly flooded the tunnel from both directions. NYPD. The voice boomed through a megaphone. Exit the vehicle with your hands visible. Florence watched in amazement as a coordinated team of police officers surrounded the car, their movements precise and professional. This wasn't some random traffic stop. This was a planned operation. Martinez's face had gone ashen. This is impossible. How could they? Because, Florence said, understanding flooding through her, Aaron Murray didn't become a billionaire by backing down from a fight. Through the car's rear window, Florence saw a familiar figure stepping out of an unmarked police car. Detective Sarah Chun, the woman who had helped Florence navigate the legal system when she first arrived in New York, approached with a team of federal agents. But it was the man stepping out of the passenger seat who made Florence's breath catch. Aaron, still in his hospital clothes, his face set with grim determination. As Martinez and his accomplice were handcuffed and read their rights, Florence found herself face-to-face with Detective Chun, who was carefully cutting the zip ties from her wrists. Ms. Vasquez, Chun said with a gentle smile, or should I say Ms. Santos? Your employer made some very interesting phone calls after you left the hospital. Florence looked past Chun to where Aaron was standing, Olive sleeping peacefully in a car seat beside him. Their eyes met across the chaos of the arrest scene, and Florence saw something that made her knees weak with relief. Not anger, not betrayal, but fierce protectiveness. "I don't understand," Florence whispered. "How did you?" "The moment you left that hospital room, I knew something was wrong," Aaron said, approaching carefully. "You would never abandon Olive voluntarily, no matter what secrets you were carrying. So I called every contact I had in law enforcement and asked them to run Martinez's credentials." Detective Chen nodded. "Turns out your Detective Martinez was kicked off the Barcelona police force 3 years ago for corruption. The real investigation into your husband's death was handled by Detective Rodriguez, who's been trying to find you to offer witness protection, not to harm you." Florence felt tears streaming down her face as the weight of months of fear began to lift. "Carlos's files are safely in the hands of Interpol, thanks to information you provided in your original testimony," Chen continued. "The locket was just a wedding gift, Florence. Your husband never hid anything in it. Martinez was lying, trying to get you to confess to knowledge you didn't have." Aaron stepped closer, and Florence could see the exhaustion and worry etched in his features. "When I realized you were in danger, real danger, nothing else mattered. Not the lies, not the secrets, not even my mother's objections." "Your mother," Florence said, suddenly remembering Margaret's role in the evening's events. Aaron's expression darkened. "Is facing some serious questions about how Martinez got access to our security footage and private information. It seems my mother's investigators weren't as legitimate as she claimed." Florence looked at Olive, sleeping so peacefully despite the chaos that had surrounded her short life. "Is she safe? Are you both safe now?" "The criminal organization Martinez worked for is being dismantled as we speak," Detective Chen assured her. "Your original testimony was the keystone that brought down their entire money laundering operation. You've been a protected witness all along, you just didn't know it." Florence sank against the tunnel wall, overwhelmed by the rapid reversal of everything she believed about her situation. "I thought I was putting you in danger," she whispered to Aaron. "I thought loving Olive, caring about you both, was selfish and wrong." Aaron handed Olive's car seat to a nearby officer and stepped close enough that Florence could see the vulnerability in his gray eyes. "Florence, what you did tonight, leaving to protect us, that wasn't selfish. That was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed." "But I lied to you," Florence protested. "About my name, my past, the reason I came to New York." "You survived," Aaron corrected firmly. "You escaped from trauma and danger, found a way to heal, and became the most important person in my daughter's life. The details of how you got there don't change who you are now." Detective Chen cleared her throat diplomatically. "Mr. Murray, Ms. Santos, we're going to need you both to come in for debriefing. But first, Florence, there's someone who's been waiting to speak with you." A video call appeared on Chen's tablet, revealing a kind-faced Spanish woman in a Barcelona police station. "Florence? This is Detective Rodriguez. I've been looking for you for nearly a year to tell you how sorry I am for your loss, and how grateful we are for your courage in coming forward about Carlos's activities." Florence stared at the screen, seeing genuine compassion in the detective's eyes. "I was so afraid. Martinez told me." "Martinez told you lies to manipulate you into running scared instead of seeking help," Rodriguez interrupted. "Your testimony helped us save dozens of other families from the criminals who killed Carlos and Sofia. You're a hero, Florence, not a victim." As the call ended, Florence felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. For the first time in nearly a year, she wasn't running from her past. She was standing in her present, surrounded by people who wanted to protect rather than exploit her. Aaron reached out tentatively and touched her hand. "Florence, I know everything's complicated right now, but I need you to know, Olive needs you. I need you. Not as an employee, but as family." Florence looked up into his eyes and saw her future there, not the dark, fearful existence she'd been dreading, but something bright and hopeful and real. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "After everything that's happened, all the danger I brought to your door?" Aaron's smile was soft but certain. "Florence, You didn't bring danger to our door. You brought love, healing, and the strength to face whatever comes next. That's not something I'm willing to lose." As Olive stirred in her car seat and made the soft sounds that meant she was waking up hungry, Florence felt her heart fill with a hope she'd thought was lost forever. Maybe, just maybe, she'd found her way home after all. 3 weeks later, Florence stood in the marble foyer of the Murray penthouse, watching Margaret Murray's face cycle through expressions of shock, fury, and grudging acceptance as Detective Chin finished explaining the investigation's findings. "So you're telling me," Margaret said slowly, her voice tight with controlled rage, "that my private investigator was working with criminals? That the information he provided about Florence was fabricated?" "Not fabricated," Chin corrected. "Manipulated. Florence's husband was indeed involved with dangerous people, but as a victim, not a willing participant. And Florence's testimony helped bring down a network that had been operating internationally for over a decade." Florence felt Aaron's reassuring presence beside her as she cradled Olive, who had grown visibly more content and healthy in the weeks since the crisis had resolved. The baby's frequent crying spells had disappeared entirely once Florence was able to provide consistent, stress-free care. Margaret's sharp blue eyes fixed on Florence with reluctant respect. "And the incident that started all this? The night Aaron found you with Olive?" Florence lifted her chin, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "Olive was inconsolable. I was able to help her because my body was still responding to my own loss. It wasn't planned or inappropriate. It was a mother's instinct to comfort a child in need." "A mother's instinct," Margaret repeated thoughtfully, her gaze moving between Florence and the peacefully sleeping baby. "Yes, I suppose it was." The admission hung in the air like a flag of surrender. Margaret Murray, the iron-willed matriarch who had controlled the family fortune for decades, was acknowledging Florence as more than just hired help. "Mother," Aaron said carefully, "there's something else we need to discuss." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly bracing herself for another revelation. Aaron moved closer to Florence, his hand finding hers with natural ease. "Florence and I are getting married." The silence that followed was so profound that Olive's soft breathing seemed loud in comparison. Florence felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched Margaret process this announcement. "Married," Margaret said flatly. "To the nanny." "To the woman I love," Aaron corrected firmly. "The woman who saved Olive's life more than once. The woman who brought light back into this house after Victoria died." Florence squeezed Aaron's hand, still amazed by how naturally he'd integrated her into his life once the truth was out. There had been no awkward transition period, no careful negotiations about roles and boundaries. He'd simply opened his heart and home completely, as if she'd always belonged there. Margaret was silent for a long moment, studying Florence's face with the intensity of someone solving a complex puzzle. Finally, she spoke. "You know, Florence, when Aaron first married Victoria, I was concerned about her background, her family's financial situation. I thought she was after our money." Margaret's voice grew softer, more reflective. "I was wrong. Victoria loved my son completely, genuinely. And I can see now that you do too." Florence felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected acceptance in Margaret's voice. "But," Margaret continued, her tone sharpening slightly, "if you hurt my son or my granddaughter, if this is some elaborate long-term deception." "Mother," Aaron warned, but Florence spoke over him. "Mrs. Murray, I understand your concerns. I've already lost one family to violence and tragedy. The thought of anything happening to Aaron or Olive terrifies me more than any threat I've ever faced. They're not just my future, they're my reason for having one." Margaret studied Florence for another long moment, then suddenly smiled, the first genuine smile Florence had ever seen from the formidable woman. "Well then," Margaret said briskly, "I suppose we should start planning a wedding. Nothing too elaborate. Mind you, we've had enough drama for 1 year. But it should be worthy of the Murray name." Florence exchanged a glance with Aaron, seeing her own amazement reflected in his eyes. They'd expected resistance, arguments, possibly even threats to cut off Olive's inheritance. Instead, Margaret was offering acceptance and approval. "There is one condition," Margaret added, and Florence tensed. "I want to be involved in Olive's upbringing. Not as a controlling presence, but as her grandmother. I've missed too much already because of my own stubborn pride." Florence looked down at Olive, who chose that moment to open her eyes and gaze up with that alert, intelligent expression that reminded Florence so much of Aaron. "I would love that," Florence said softly. "Olive should know her grandmother. Every child deserves to be surrounded by family who love them." The word family seemed to resonate in the elegant foyer, creating a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Detective Chun, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, stepped forward with a final folder of documents. "Florence, there's one more thing. The Spanish government has officially cleared you of any wrongdoing in the investigation. Your refugee status has been upgraded to permanent residency, and you're eligible to apply for citizenship whenever you're ready." Florence felt Aaron's arm tighten around her waist as the full weight of her new reality settled in. She was free. Free from fear, free from running, free to build the life she'd never dared to dream possible. "And," Chin added with a smile, "Detective Rodriguez asked me to give you this." Florence opened the small package to find a photograph of her and Carlos on their wedding day, smiling and young and full of hope. Below it was a note in Spanish. "Florence, Carlos would be proud of the woman you've become and the family you've built. Live fully, love completely, and know that Sophia's memory lives on in the love you give to Olive. Detective Rodriguez." Florence pressed the photograph to her heart, feeling the last pieces of her shattered past finally settling into peaceful memory rather than painful wound. Olive stirred in her arms, making the soft cooing sounds that meant she was hungry. As Florence automatically began the gentle swaying motion that soothed the baby, she caught Margaret watching with something like wonder. "She's never that calm with anyone else," Margaret observed. "Not even with Aaron sometimes." "Florence has a gift," Aaron said, his voice warm with pride. Olive recognized it from the very beginning. As if to prove his point, Olive reached up with one tiny hand and grasped Florence's finger, holding on with the determined grip of a child who knew she was safe and loved. Florence looked around the foyer, at Margaret, who was softening with each passing moment, at Detective Chun, who had become an unexpected ally, at Aaron, whose love had given her the courage to stop running, and finally down at Olive, the little girl who had healed Florence's broken heart by letting her heal Olive's lonely one. 6 months ago, Florence had arrived in New York as a refugee fleeing tragedy and trauma. Now she stood in the same spot as a bride-to-be, surrounded by family, with legal protection and a future full of possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Aaron asked softly, following her gaze around their home. Florence smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'm thinking about second chances," she said, "and how sometimes the family you choose is even stronger than the one you're born into." Olive made a happy gurgling sound, as if agreeing with the sentiment, and Florence felt her heart overflow with gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. The past year had tested her in ways she never could have imagined, but it had also given her gifts beyond price: love, healing, and the knowledge that sometimes the best way to honor those you've lost is to embrace the life and love that remains. What do you think makes a family? Blood relations or the bonds we choose to create? Have you ever found unexpected family in unlikely places? Share your thoughts about chosen family in the comments below. 1 year later. Florence stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse nursery, watching the first snow of winter dust the Manhattan skyline. In her arms, 15-month-old Olive babbled happily, her chubby fingers reaching for the dancing snowflakes beyond the glass. "Neve," Florence said softly in Spanish, then repeated in English, "Snow mi amor." "No," Olive declared with the fierce determination of a toddler discovering her own voice, making Florence laugh. "Yes, sweetheart, snow. But don't worry, we'll go play in it later." The sound of familiar footsteps made Florence turn, her heart still doing that little skip it had done every day for the past year whenever Aaron came home. He appeared in the nursery doorway, his face lighting up at the sight of his two favorite people in the world. "There are my girls," he said, crossing the room to wrap his arms around both Florence and Olive. "How was your day?" Olive immediately reached for her father, chattering in the mixture of Spanish, English, and toddler gibberish that had become her unique language. Aaron took her easily, spinning her in a gentle circle that made her giggle with delight. Florence watched them with the deep contentment that had become her daily companion. The past year had brought challenges. Integrating two grief-stricken people into a functioning family wasn't simple, but it had also brought joy she'd never thought she'd feel again. "Mrs. Henderson made Olive's favorite cookies today," Florence said, settling into the rocking chair where she'd spent so many late nights soothing a crying baby. Now it was where she read bedtime stories and sang lullabies to a happy, healthy toddler. "And your mother called. She wants to take Olive to the zoo tomorrow." Aaron raised an eyebrow. "My mother? At the zoo? With animals and dirt and chaos?" Florence grinned. "She's been practicing with that stroller you bought her. I think she's determined to be the fun grandmother she never was with you." The transformation in Margaret Murray had been one of the year's most surprising developments. The woman who had once viewed Florence as a threat had become her staunchest ally, throwing herself into grandmotherhood with the same intensity she'd once reserved for business dealings. "Speaking of my mother," Aaron said, settling Olive on his lap as she played with his tie, "she wanted me to remind you about the charity gala next week. Something about making sure your dress coordinates with Olive's outfit." Florence rolled her eyes fondly. "She's determined to show us off to all her society friends. I think she takes personal credit for our happiness." "Maybe she should," Aaron said thoughtfully. "If she hadn't been so determined to investigate you, Martinez might never have found you. And if Martinez hadn't found you, we would have kept dancing around our feelings for another 6 months," Florence finished with a laugh. "Yes, I suppose we owe her a debt of gratitude for forcing us to confront the truth." Olive had grown bored with Aaron's tie and was now reaching for Florence, making the grabbing motions that meant she wanted to be passed back and forth between her parents. It was a game she'd invented months ago, as if she needed constant confirmation that both her mother and father were present and accounted for. As Florence took Olive back, her wedding ring caught the light from the nursery lamp. The simple platinum band had been Aaron's choice, elegant but understated, nothing that would overshadow the meaning it represented. Their wedding had been small and perfect, held in the penthouse garden with Olive as their flower girl and Margaret tearfully walking Florence down the aisle. Detective Chun had attended, along with Mrs. Henderson and the small circle of friends who had become their chosen family. "Florence," Aaron said suddenly, his voice taking on the tone that meant he had something important to say. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression she'd learned to recognize, love mixed with gratitude and wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe their happiness was real. "What is it?" she asked softly. "I've been thinking about what you said last year about second chances and chosen family," he began, moving to kneel beside the rocking chair. "And I realized something." Florence's breath caught as Aaron reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Not a ring box, but something else entirely. "You gave Olive the gift of a mother's love when she needed it most," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the gift of learning to love again when I thought that part of me had died with Victoria. But there's one more gift I want to give you, if you'll accept it." He opened the box to reveal official-looking documents, and Florence's heart began to race as she read the heading, "Petition for Adult Adoption." "Aaron," she whispered, tears already blurring her vision. "I want you to be a Murray not just through marriage, but through legal adoption into the family," he explained. "I want Olive to have siblings who share her name, who belong to this family completely. I want you to have the security of knowing that no matter what happens, you're not just my wife, you're my family in every way that matters." Florence couldn't speak through her tears, but Olive seemed to sense the importance of the moment. The toddler reached up to pat Florence's face with gentle curiosity, then turned to Aaron and babbled something that sounded remarkably like approval. "Is that a yes?" Aaron asked, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. Florence managed to nod, then found her voice. Yes. Oh, Aaron, yes. As he slipped the adoption papers into her hands, Florence felt the final piece of her new identity click into place. She was no longer Florence Santos, the widow running from tragedy. She wasn't even Florence Vasquez, the nanny hiding her past. She was Florence Murray, wife, mother, and permanent member of a family that had chosen to love her completely. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 o'clock, the same sound that had marked so many significant moments in their journey together. But now, instead of announcing crisis or separation, it was simply marking another ordinary moment in their extraordinary life. "Mama," Olive said clearly, looking directly at Florence. It wasn't the first time Olive had called her that. The word had emerged naturally as Florence became the primary nurturing presence in the toddler's life. But tonight, with the adoption papers in her hands and Aaron's love surrounding them both, the word felt like a benediction. "Yes, me Nina," Florence whispered, kissing Olive's forehead. "Mama's here. Mama's always going to be here." As Aaron wrapped his arms around both of them, Florence looked out at the snow-covered city beyond their windows. Somewhere out there, other families were struggling with loss, with fear, with the challenge of building love from the ashes of tragedy. But here, in this warm nursery filled with toys and laughter and the sweet sound of Olive's contentment, Florence had found something she'd thought was lost forever: home. Not just a place, but a feeling. Not just safety, but belonging. Not just survival, but joy. Olive yawned and snuggled closer to Florence, her little body growing heavy with approaching sleep. Soon it would be time for bath and bedtime story, for the gentle routine that marked the end of another peaceful day. But for now, Florence was content to sit in her rocking chair, surrounded by the two people who had saved her life by letting her save theirs, watching snow fall on the city where she'd learned that sometimes the most broken hearts can heal into something stronger and more beautiful than they ever were before. Love, Florence reflected, wasn't just about finding someone to share your life with. It was about finding the courage to let someone share their life with you, completely, honestly, and without reservation. And as Olive's breathing deepened into sleep and Aaron hummed a soft lullaby, Florence smiled and settled in to enjoy another quiet evening with her family. Her chosen family. Her forever family. Her home. Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized you'd found your true home? Not just a place, but with people who truly understand and love you? What does family mean to you, and how has your definition changed over time? Share your stories of love, belonging, and second chances in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else who's still searching for their own place to belong.